So in the paradigm that we are, steeped in, conditioned by, we assume that we are a somebody, and that somebody exists in this meat, and that this somebody is self-contained and existing over here. And then when we look at our experience, we see evidence. This is why challenging a paradigm is so difficult, because the paradigm, the beliefs that you're challenging are the very beliefs that are shaping your current experience. So there's a set of beliefs, they shape your experience, so they give you the experience of being somebody here in this, and then when you challenge them, it seems ludicrous, because you go, well, this is obvious, of course I'm over here. But the reason it feels so obvious is because we've been conditioned to experience it that way. That's why the philosopher Alfred Whitehead said, it takes a very unusual mind to question the obvious. And this is what he was getting at. And so what I'm asking you today is to use your mind in a very unusual way. This is not so that we all end up in some bizarre interpretation of reality. All this is so that we can loosen our minds up from the current paradigm so that something else might actually get in. I don't have an answer for you, really. I just have some possibilities I want you to entertain tonight and just see what happens to your head when you start to think of them. So I'm going to give you one now. It's a fun one that I just started to use. I didn't make it up. This is actually a classic thought experiment from at least in the West, in the Western tradition, it was made famous by Rene Descartes when he started to question in this way, and then decided he didn't want to trust anybody, especially not the church. So what he asked himself was, and then I'm going to ask you the same thing, and then I want you to think about it. How do you know this is not a dream? How can you be sure that this is not a dream? That you're not going to wake up and be in bed, dreaming this? Have any of you ever lucid dreamed? Anybody? Isn't it awesome? So lucid dream, this is like classically how this would always happen for me, because I used to really be into it. A lucid dream would occur to me in this forum, where I'd be here giving a talk, and my mother would be sitting in this empty seat. And I'd be giving my talk, and and then I go, Mom? And then I'd think, my mother would never come to this talk. And then I'd go, oh, it's a dream. And then once you wake up, if you ever try this, it's so awesome. You can get books that kind of help you do it, but it's hard. But once you realize it's a dream, then you're in this very awkward place, because you start to get excited. And it's good if you get excited, because the excitement is kind of what wakes you up out of the dream. So you're like, whoa! And then you pick stuff up. You go, oh, feels just like real. Oh my God, let's see what the water tastes like in dreams. Oh my God, it tastes exactly the same. But if you get too excited, then you wake up and you're in bed and you go, oh, darn, I want to go back to sleep. But if you don't, so you try to stay calm enough so you don't wake up. But if you get too calm, you fall back asleep. And then you wake up and it's morning and you go, ah. Oh. But I got pretty good at it, where I could really stay in the dream. And then you can do cool things like, because you're basically omnipotent, it's your dream. So I could say, hey, this will be great. I think I'll play a guitar solo. And I'll go like this, and a guitar will appear, and all of a sudden I'll be magically awesome at it. And everyone, and then it won't be just you guys. I'll just envision a crowd of thousands. It's completely, you can have anything you want. It's a dream. So the question is, how do you know this isn't a lucid dream? Because I can tell you that when you're in a dream, and probably all know, because you've been in them, I'm assuming, they feel totally real when you're in them. You don't realize they're a dream until you wake up, and then you realize it was a dream because now you're comparing it to being in bed and going, oh, well, I was just now in that rock concert, and now I'm in bed, so I think that must have been a dream. But it didn't feel like a dream when you were in it. So how do you know this isn't a dream? For the last 500 years, people have been asking this question, and nobody's really come up with an answer but maybe you did.
Does it matter if you know it's a dream?
Doesn't matter if you know it's a dream or not. No. What? Okay, it doesn't matter if you know it's a dream or not. This is what his question. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that you know you can't tell. Right? Right. Well, if you know you can't tell, then that opens up the space of a question. So to me, in the end, everything that I do is about how do you support people to live in the space of a question rather than the space of certainty. We all want to live in a space of certainty. I know the way it is. And I'm saying there's a whole other life that's possible for you if you're living in a space of not knowing, a place that's open and receptive and unsure. So that's why it's important to realize you can't tell the difference. Now I can go back the other direction and I can say, because we all say, hey, but obviously this is matter. And then I would say, well, how do you know it's matter, really? How do you know this is matter? And you might say, well, and this is where oh my God, there's so many interesting things. I'm going to go in all kinds of directions. This is the problem with talking. We live in a scientific materialist paradigm. The scientific materialist paradigm is the church of the day. So in the Middle Ages, the church was the Christian church, mainly in Europe. Basically, the whole idea with the church is we know what's true, you don't know what's true. So then when Galileo came around with all of his mathematics, and circles, and was started to say the earth was rotating, or that the earth was going around the sun, the church said, hold on, that is not true. Well, how do you know? Because we know, because we are the holders of truth, and you all have to just do what we say or we kill you, right? That was kind of the basic idea. So the Enlightenment happened, and the whole, the Enlightenment, the whole big idea of the Enlightenment was a few people who said, I think we can figure stuff out. Maybe we can use our brains and figure stuff out, and then we don't have to believe the church. And the church said, that's wrong. We're burning your books. We're going to burn you at the stake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, science won the battle. It took a long time. It's kind of a fascinating story. And now we live in the world where science is the new church. And so what if we said morning rotation? This is a thought. I really want to get 20 people who are willing to do this. Just always say morning rotation and evening rotation. And then 10 years from now, let's see if when we see that thing that we're calling morning rotation, we actually feel ourselves rolling forward into the sun. Because I bet we will. We'll just change our neurology so that we start to feel the Earth's rotation. And, Buckminster Fuller was so adamant about this because he felt like part of the reason we're destroying the planet is because we're living in a medieval sensibility of the earth and not a modern one. So in the same way, what I want to say is that your experience of living, of being inside a material body that's thinking is a conditioned experience. And because we keep talking about it that way over and over and over again, we keep having the feeling that this is the case. But the fact that it feels that way doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it not true either. Right, absolutely. So in the work that I do, I call this particular way of using your mind a wormhole inquiry. Because it's not about coming to a new truth that you can now believe in. Right? It's about holding two things that are contradictory, and neither one can be proven, and yet they're contradictory, right? So basically, it's a paradox of a sense. So how do you hold these two things that both fit? For instance, how do you hold the fact that the material theory about all this holds up to your experience, but also this could be a dream. And you can't tell which is which. And if you really keep letting yourself hold those until they really get to be equal, there's a kind of intensity that makes you feel like, oh my God, if I keep going this way, I'm going to go crazy. And if you hold yourself in the intensity of not knowing, my experience is there's a possibility that something completely different will pop through. right? Because you're actually not knowing, and so then something can come through. And so I call it a wormhole inquiry because that something coming through is like falling through a wormhole, a wormhole in space that takes you from one universe to another. And that's kind of what this kind of inquiry is all about. It's not about me coming in and telling you a new sense of self that you can then adhere to and then feel good that you now know this. It's about just not knowing. So I want you to close your eyes again. And I want you to just become aware of the difference between raw sensation and interpreted sensation. See, it's very difficult because we interpret our sensation so quickly that often we mistake interpreted sensation for raw sensation. This is like a meditative skill that I think traditionally it just takes years to develop it, but I personally believe it wouldn't need to take that long. So the trick, and you can feel, you may be able to feel it, the trick is, as soon as you feel something, the knowing of what it is appears almost instantaneously. Like, that's my hand, that's my knee. But if you, before that knowing appears, before the words appear, there's just a sensation. So I'm just asking you to become aware of the raw sensation prior to interpretation. Which is really just another way to ask you to not know, to just let go of all knowing. Okay, thank you. So from a materialistic viewpoint, the way that you think about the universe is that it's a universe of space, of matter and space that has developed over time. That's materialism. It's a good theory. And even though it's very dominant right now, it's only been dominant for the last few hundred years. Prior to that, idealism was really the dominant theory of reality. And idealism says that the foundation of reality is consciousness, is mind, is maybe you could imagine it as that raw sensation, uninterpreted sensation. And then, so in the materialist viewpoint, the universe starts as empty space and material particles and stuff that collect into everything that we currently see and feel, including ourselves. In idealism, everything starts as kind of pure experience or raw sensational potential, and that starts to get interpreted, and eventually it gets interpreted exactly into the shape that we're currently interpreting it, at least for our species. And the interpretation is such a strong habit that we don't know how to see it any other way, that we're stuck in this particular interpretation. And central to that interpretation is the interpretation of ourselves as being the being that exists in this skin-encased body. And in addition, we see ourselves as being the seat of consciousness. So that consciousness we think is coming from inside us. Usually we associate it with our brain. Maybe some people associate it with our hearts. But we think we're conscious, for sure. And we think that the consciousness is coming from us, which is why we think we're going to die, because we are associated with our consciousness, and we think that consciousness is going to disappear when the body disappears. My experience tells me that that's not what's going to happen, that the consciousness that I am was here before this body appeared, and it will be here after. It just won't be in this form. It'll be somewhere else, in some other form. So the way that we develop the identity that we have is we develop this capacity for abstract reason, which is the capacity, part of which is the capacity to identify things. So first we identified physical things: glass, water, book, table. I guess in the early days we were probably identifying other things than those. We were identifying, who knows, enemy, cave, whatever we were identifying. But we learned how to identify things. First they were concrete, and then later they became abstract. We could identify things like emotions, love. We could start to identify things like political systems, democracy, economic systems, capitalism, socialism, right? These are not physical, tangible things, but they're things. They're things that we can identify. And we created one called ourselves, which is a collection of ideas about ourselves that we now go, okay, this is now an abstract thing. It's called Jeff. And, in the kind of neti traditions, you go through and say, okay, you realize you're not your body. You have a body, but you're not your body. You have thoughts, but you're not your thoughts. Of course, the easy ones, I have a job, but I'm not my job, but we all already know that. The trickier ones have to do with thoughts and feelings. I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings. I have those things. I experience those things, but the one that experienced them is not them. And if you keep going back and back and back, that's when you have this opportunity of falling into emptiness. That's the Satori experience, is you start going back so fast that you trip and you kind of fall into nothing. And I actually currently know someone who had a very powerful Satori a couple of weeks ago, and so she's now in this state of, it's a little bit treacherous place at the beginning, because it can become very nihilistic, because you're not sure, you don't really exist, nothing really exists. It can get very tricky, but if you keep going, you'll find something else on the other side of the nihilism. So we learned how to identify a me, right? A Jeff that has all kinds of qualities and characteristics. And then I assume that there's a somebody that all of those qualities and characteristics belong to. But that's an assumption, and you can never find that somebody. And it has nothing to do with what you know. In fact, everything that you know is kind of going to work against you in this particular domain, because it's all connected to you knowing it, right? So the whole idea that I know something is already connected to the one who knows. So that's why they say, your knowing won't help. And in some ways that's true. So we created an identity, right? So this is talk tonight is who are you, an exploration of identity. We created an identity, and if we were doing like a week on identity, I could ask you to write out all the different characteristics of your identity, and you'd be able to check them off that none of them are you. And you'd see how incredibly detailed our identity is, and you'll also see it's actually just a story. Your identity is a story about you that you assume is pointing to an actual person that story is about. Yes, sir.
Why do we do that?
Why do we do that?
Why do we create this identity?
Oh, good question. Why do we create this identity? Well, I don't want to demonize the identity either, because the reason we created it is because that's how this is like me talking, how do I know why we created the identity? I'm just going to say what I...
Not necessarily for an answer.
Right, but I'm going to give you one anyway, because I can't help myself. Identity, language and identity are the mediums through which we interact as human beings. And the way culture evolves is identity, new identities are formed that allow us to interact in more harmonious and more beneficial ways. And so there's nothing wrong with identity. I'm not a real fan of living without identity. I don't know that anyone does. But okay, good. So like basically here's my theory. I have this very strange job, which I selected for myself, which is to teach this kind of thing. And there is no authority here. There's just ideas, and hopefully the ideas lead to something positive. But I believe that the way human beings progress, either as individuals or as cultures, is through a succession of the growth of new identity, right? So the medieval identity was one thing, and inside that identity, where you were a serf in some big chain of being and you had no option of going. And in medieval times, most people didn't even have a concept that you could think. They when they would read, they would look at, most people couldn't read, but those people that could read, when they read, they thought the words were moving their mouth. They didn't think that the words had meaning that went in their brain and that they were then speaking. They thought, just like when I touch this glass, right, the glass is shaping where my fingers can go. So in the same way, they thought when you look at these words, the words make your mouth move. Because they didn't understand the concept of mind. So imagine what kind of self-identity you have when you don't even understand the concept. Like, there's no way we can get into the identity of a medieval serf, because it's so different from where we are. And in the world of that identity, we can look back. Historically, you could see what was possible. And not a whole heck of a lot, really, and a lot of stuff that was really violent and pretty horrible. And so through movements like the troubadours and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we developed this identity of the thinking thing, is the way I like to refer to it, the one that we have. And look at the world that the thinking thing creates. Much better. Still got a lot of problems, I guarantee, but nobody's like, if they had a plane that came and said, okay, this is a trip to the 1100s, anybody want to go? There's no way I'm getting on that plane. But I want to go on a trip to like 1,000 years from now, when things are even better. And the way that you take that trip is that you participate in the formation of the next sense of self. So today's talk is roughly in the domain of a book I wrote called The Soul of a New Self. So all of this kind of contemplation is all about loosening up our adherence to our current identity so that we're more available and more free for a new possibility of identity to emerge, so that we're not so glued to what we currently see. And this goes way below the who am I question, which has to do with, am I Jeff or am I Matt? It has to do with the what question, what am I? And I think I want to end the talk with just a little reframing of the theory of evolution. This is something I used to do a lot at one time, but I haven't done it in a long time, but I think it's feeling good right now. So we're going to just go with more or less the theory of evolution as it's currently known, even though I'm not really sure how true that is, but we're going to go with it for the moment. And imagine that at the beginning of the universe, there was an intelligence. So this is what idealism would say: the universe begins with consciousness, not with matter. Robert Lanza, the physicist, actually he's a biologist, but he's writes about quantum theory, says he has a theory called biocentrism, in which he says, you know, our current materialist viewpoint has some major problems with it, and those could be solved if we just made a little bit of a shift. The major problems are we don't know where life came from, and we don't know where consciousness come from. And given the primacy of life and consciousness, a theory that can't explain those things is really a theory that's probably one we need to question. And he said, you know, you can avoid those problems if you return to a more idealistic assumption and assume that there was that the universe is living from the start and conscious from the start. So you start with consciousness, and then let's even say that matter forms. Who knows? Maybe it's true. Matter starts to form, and matter holds a certain amount of consciousness. But depending on the form of matter, you know, you get more and more consciousness able to be held until you start to get these, you know, what we call living beings. But of course, in this theory, everything's alive. So a rock is also alive, as well as a tree, as well as an animal, as well as a human. It's just, we only recognize life that looks like our life. You know, so we don't recognize the life of a rock because it looks too bizarre to us. But assuming it's true, what happens in human beings is that finally, the consciousness that's emerging through this form as being human is able to form a self-concept. But because it's the first species to form a self-concept, it makes the mistake of assuming the consciousness that it's now become aware of is coming from itself, because it looks around and goes, well, it's not, doesn't seem to be coming from any of these other animals, must be coming from me. Now imagine if another species developed consciousness. That would be a real newsflash, right? If all of a sudden we discovered that there was some lizard somewhere and they were like having conversations in their own language and they had their own technology, we'd be like, whoa, we got something wrong. So hopefully that'll happen, but if it doesn't, you know, we can understand why on any planet where self-conscious awareness arose first in a single species, that species would mistakenly assume that the consciousness was coming from itself. But if you were the intelligence that was there from the start, this is the way I like to think about it, you know, if you were there and you'd be watching this whole thing, imagine if you've been watching, this is like the most boring show in the universe. It takes trillions of years, and for the first like 10 trillion, it's just kind of energies and collisions of subatomic particles, and you're watching every day, hoping for something. Then eventually, on this one planet, you see, there's a self-conscious life form. There's finally a life form that recognizes it's conscious, and look what it can do. Oh my God, it's amazing. But it thinks it's conscious. It doesn't realize the consciousness is coming from me, from the universe itself. And it's hoping that somebody's going to realize. You know, it's like, I think of it as like one of those theaters where they do the operation and then all the students watch from the glass. And so in the glass, there's something like God or the consciousness of the universe looking in from the outside, trying to get the attention of somebody on that little planet, going, no, it's me. And then finally someone looks up and goes, I get it. The consciousness that's coming through me isn't mine. It doesn't exist just from this body. It's coming through the whole universe. I'm just the mouthpiece. I'm just the end point of this. And then what happens to your sense of identity if you realize that you're not just a single life form on a planet, but you are the consciousness of the entire cosmos? So see, I had a very bizarre life. But I came into this world knowing a secret that I later forgot. And now when I look back, I realize, right or wrong, the life I'm living was going to unfold based on how I came in. So when I was like 3, 4, I used to have this trick, which is I would go into the bathroom, my parents' house, obviously. They had a full-length mirror on the door, and I would lock the door to lock myself in, and then I would stare at my own eyes. And I would just sit there. And then I would wait until I started to blow up. And my eyes would start to rise because my body was getting bigger. And then I would go through the roof. First I'd go through like the floor above, then through the roof, then I'd be as big as the town, then I'd be as big as the world, and then I'd go all the way out until the entire universe was my body. And it was just elation, you know, and then when I got there, I would just enjoy it for a minute. It's like some kind of cosmic ecstasy. And then I would let myself get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then I'd go back through the roof, back through the second floor, and then boom, I'd be my like 4-year-old self staring in my own eyes. And then I just unlock the door and go like that. And I would do it whenever I felt a little blue, you know. And then one day, I couldn't do it anymore. I went in the bathroom and I looked, and I just had no idea how I used to do that. And I got so depressed. And later I kind of forgot about it until I was a bit older, and then I started on a spiritual search, which now I realize was a search for what I had lost. And it wasn't until I was about 39 and I was on a retreat and I was sitting in meditation and I went up through the roof and I got as big as the whole cosmos again. And I had that experience of just exhilarating ecstasy of recognizing who I was. And then I came back down, and when I got back down into my meditation cushion, I thought, holy shit, I used to do that when I was like 4. And then I had this whole memory of what I would do when I was a kid. And so the reason I'm just wanting to shake up your identity is because that cosmic being is who I personally believe we are. And the intelligence of that cosmic being is getting crammed through the filter of our belief in being just this little bit of meat. And I know that if we loosen up that identity, we start to become available for a kind of recognition of the reality of who we are. And this is kind of what I do. And it's really, it's a very strange job. I never intended to be doing anything like this, but I can't not do it because, you know, what we are is so magnificent, and what we are willing to settle for is so small. And I don't really know how to share this, so I just keep trying.